I know writers who use subtext and they're all cowards.
The Devil in Me, more like the poop in pee. The finale to the first season of the Dark Pictures Anthology is in a word disappointing, and in approximately 15,100 words here's my full thoughts. Playing this game is like dating in your 20s. It can be fun, at times interesting, however you quickly find yourself looking for any kind of commitment and all it seems to want to do is fuck around. Whilst occasionally showing flashes of innovation, The Devil in Me is largely lacking, a meandering and technically incompetent mess that strings you along with its few good ideas and admittedly fun aesthetic. It's a bad game, but annoyingly it consistently threatens to be good. To illustrate my point, I'm going to discuss this title ad nauseum, from its development and the hiccups of that to its narrative and gameplay failings. Unlike any of my prior videos, I'm going to structure this in a more conventional YouTube video format, breaking down the plot beat by beat with extensive commentary on every major event contained within, though this video is not a substitute for having played the game yourself and you will benefit from having played it. If you personally enjoyed this game, I respect that take. Art is entirely subjective after all, but I hope this video can illustrate why myself and potentially many others find this title so frustrating. As you can tell from the length, this video slightly spiraled out beyond its initial scope and has become something of a treatise on writing, art, and the intersection of narrative and gameplay experience. It's not intended to be watched in a single run, unless you really need to get all that ironing done. Chapters are available. If at any point you want to enter a multi-hour long slopathon, you can check out my extended slopography on this channel and subscribe whilst you're there. I'd like to gain at least 1 subscriber from this video. Thanks to the members, these guys make it happen.
The last series was so on track. It was a very beautifully conceived and didn't quite hit the mark as I was hoping it would. It's a fucking mess, to be honest with you.
Before really starting this discussion, I want to do the video essayist's signature move and overly qualify all of my statements in a futile attempt to make people agree with me more. When I say The Devil in Me is a bad game, I don't think it's for lack of trying, and it's obviously a contentious take. Fundamentally, I believe there are 2 kinds of bad art, if indeed any art can be called bad. The first and honestly worst kind is when something is creatively bankrupt. Clearly a cynical attempt to tap into an audience by sheer brute force and ticking points on a checkbox obviously created by out-of-touch executives or content creators. Usually they're chasing an audience who they don't understand or really represent the interests of. In some cases the audience doesn't even seem to exist. This kind of project ends up feeling unexciting, as rather than having the momentum of a genuine movement or strong creative desire behind it, it's been churned out into a cultural landscape which it poorly reflects. In the world of gaming, think about asset flip games, as well as any major AAA flop in recent years, in the vein of Forspoken, Gollum, really anything like that. More broadly, think about things like the corporate Memphis art style, cash grab sequels to beloved IPs, or the coworker music meme. It's fun to hate on this kind of thing, and it's low-hanging fruit, but there's little more to say than that brief description I just gave. Almost everybody hates this because it lacks that genuine edge that allows us to connect to a work. There isn't that much more to say about this kind of art because it itself has almost nothing to say. It can be fun to shout about for a bit, but there isn't much value beyond that. The more interesting kind of bad art is when you can tell a creative or team of creatives put a lot of thought and ideas into a project and it simply doesn't come out fully realised. This is a lot harder to measure and is honestly a matter of taste. I know a lot of people who really like things that I would put into this category, but for me it largely comes down to something's ability to fully realise its own intent, to boldly state its purpose, even if the purpose is just looking really cool or being a quirky novelty. The best art has an innate confidence in itself and knows what it is. Insecure, meandering works tend to be less well received because they don't know what they want to be. This is not to say all great art has only one correct interpretation or meaning or needs to have some ham-fisted message, but rather that it should have a distinct identity which can then be shaped through the opinions of fans and critics alike. A reaction can be strongly negative or positive, but there must be a strong reaction. The worst thing that can happen to a piece of art is to get no reaction at all. If I ask you right now to think of a work that has fundamentally changed your life and the way you view the world and yourself, then more than likely you think of something with a highly defined identity, be it through strong stylistic leanings, thematic cohesion, or simply a very focused purpose. About a year ago, I visited the Louvre and saw John Martin's 1841 painting Pandemonium, a depiction of the capital of hell from John Milton's Paradise Lost. This painting inspired such strong emotion in me because it felt so intentional. From the limited yet evocative colours to the framing which emphasises both the environment and the numerous points of interest, this was a painting with purpose and meaning, yet there was enough ambiguity and content within that clear intentionality to allow for interpretation within the eyes of an onlooker. Each person's eyes will be drawn to something different, but everyone understands intrinsically what the work is saying at the broad strokes level, pun intended. This piece not only understands what it wants to be, but also the pitfalls and strengths of the medium it belongs to and the manner in which it will be approached and interacted with by onlookers. It's good art. This highly fluid and subjective definition is especially hard to attach to video games, which as a medium require variety and a balancing of narrative with countless other systems. But in my opinion, a good video game narrative will look to complement its themes with its gameplay, setting and aesthetics wherever possible. Examples being the modern Persona games showcasing their power of friendship, JRPG messaging through tying character upgrades to social links and usually casting extremely isolated individuals as villains. Papers, Please does basically all of its storytelling through its setting and core gameplay loop. Psychological horror titan Silent Hill 2 tells us almost everything about its cast through combat encounters, monster design, and the locations we find them in. Recently I played Mouthwashing for the first time. Why the long face? In that game, the ship takes the place of a mirror to the mental states of the point of view characters, a threat, and a character of its own all at once. The list of titles that manage this synthesis goes on. Loads of people way smarter than me have written some brilliant articles about the intersection of narrative and gameplay and how to bridge it efficiently within the medium. But for the sake of this argument, I'm focusing more so on a title which does not do this. I think what divides audiences on things like The Devil in Me is that if you're able to look past this game's many flaws, there's a lot of creativity at play here. Interesting story beats, fun aesthetics, an attempt to improve upon gameplay. But if these things don't fully pan out, then the audience will always be split and most people will walk away with an average rating. For all its clever ideas, it never feels like everything quite fits together to create a coherent experience with a defined scope and focus. On the contrary, it feels at times at odds with itself. It belongs in that category of media where it has just enough about it to cultivate a response among some people, but the fanfic is always going to be on par with the original project because the original feels more like a showreel of interesting concepts than a fully realised vision. Works like this are only as good as the imagination of the fanbase, as interaction with the work requires you to meet the creator in the middle. I could spend all day trying to qualify this, but it's very much a know it when you see it thing. I'm sure you've got your own takes as to what falls into this category, it's largely a matter of opinion, but for me it's all about the intentionality to stand up to scrutiny. I know this distinction is subjective, and you may completely disagree, but for now let's look at this game in length and allow me to explain exactly why it falls into this category. As a fun little game, why don't you leave a comment with a game, movie, or other work of media that you feel falls into this bad art category, and let's start some arguments. Okay, great, moving on.
I was born with the devil in me.
Say that again?
Released in 2022 and developed amidst the COVID-19 pandemic, The Devil in Me is the fourth installment of the Dark Pictures Anthology, acting as a season finale. It centres on the team of documentarians travelling to an island spa hotel to record a documentary. Whilst on this island, they're stalked by a masked killer and forced into difficult decisions where they must choose which of them survive and which die. As with all prior installments in the DPA, the team focused heavily on fan feedback to try and iterate upon the formula to mixed results. This game, more so than any before or since by Supermassive in this style, attempts to improve on the moment-to-moment gameplay. In an interview, creative director of Supermassive Games Will Doyle said, "Even though it's an anthology, we can't just go, this is purely about the story. There has to be some sort of improvement. It's also a game series, and our fans and critics expect some form of progression, so we'll see that in The Devil in Me. We're focusing quite a lot on exploration, and we're saying, what can we do here with exploration to make this more immersive, more exciting, to make you feel more engaged with it? To this end, as with all things Devil in Me, it's kind of a success, but in a much more real sense a failure. Yes, this game has more movement and puzzle elements than any of its sister entries, but these are not so consequential as perhaps was intended. Most of them appear briefly at the start of the game, then pop up very occasionally in usually uninspired ways that feel like padding. There are notable exceptions. The hide mechanic is used well in a section where Mark is sneaking around an area used to prepare mannequins, for instance, but I'm getting ahead of myself. These segments of greater movement variety honestly feel like filler more than a real addition most of the time. They never come up in areas where there's a heightened tension or a pursuing enemy, for example. And when you consider that survival horror titles of the PS2 generation were doing this to greater effect, it all falls a bit flat. Where the game does improve over its predecessors is in the role of the inventory, with characters carrying items that have a tangible effect on gameplay, often unique to the character, which makes subsequent playthroughs on Curator's Cut or in co-op mode worth doing, as you gain access to content that other characters couldn't in your initial playthrough. Some of these items are better than others, and this isn't a flawless system. But having outcomes tied not just to binary choices, but also what the player chooses to carry with them is good, at least on paper. I'll mention specific instances of this being good as we go through the plot, but whilst it feels half-baked, this is a lot more clearly an improvement than the changes to movement. Often within games that market themselves as being choice-driven, there's a series of large, clearly signposted and extremely binary choices that create the illusion of a branching story. Though often these choices are relatively inconsequential. A lot of Telltale games do this by frequently implementing a choose who lives type choice, only to kill off the other option a chapter later because the game can't account for major story changes brought about by the choice a player made. As a player, it can often feel a lot more meaningful if smaller things like discovered items or a developed relationship with an NPC leads to unforeseen outcomes, and allowing scope for these less obvious choices is a good direction to take the series in. I hope that in Season 2 there are more outcomes tied to the relationship system, player inventories, or even just minor choices. The inventory facilitates this kind of organic development to plot by tying major outcomes to far earlier and inconsequential seeming choices, whilst also allowing for more interesting open area gameplay with puzzles that require you finding certain items to progress. This is refreshing as so much of the series feels just like walking between cutscenes. Very rarely do you actually need to engage your mind in these gameplay segments. On top of that, each character feels more unique as they have an item that is unique to them and can change up gameplay for their segments, although most of these are pretty bad in this installment. In fact, the best items are given to the least interesting characters. At least twice in this game, a character's equipped items have an outcome on their fate, and that's good. It rewards preparedness and adds another dimension to choices. Again, this isn't anything new in general, but it's new for this series and a welcome improvement. It's likely that subsequent games will make use of these mechanics. Creative director Tom Heaton said as much in an interview with Chris Hyde in 2022, just prior to this game's release. Season 2 of the DPA is set to begin with the upcoming Directive 8020, and I honestly believe this has a potential to be a smash hit if Supermassive can maximise their usage of these systems. This game is set to be set in space aboard a colony ship called the Cassiopeia, the name of which I believe indicates that this will be a game about arrogance and hubris, having an arrogant crew ignorant to the threat aboard with them, and unwilling to fix things until they're too late. I think there's a lot of opportunities for dramatic irony with a concept like this. If each member of the crew aboard this ship has unique abilities tied to their roles, then that will serve to make repeat playthroughs and co-op far more involved, and allowing environments to be more open and having more traditional survival horror puzzles will do wonders for helping the sometimes languid pace of this series and add a new dimension to gameplay. Additionally, it will add a dimension of uniqueness if each character controls slightly differently dependent on their role aboard the ship, and it adds characterization through gameplay, further bridging that gap between story and mechanics I discussed earlier. Losing characters with useful abilities would also be a real blow and would up the ante in playthroughs. Since a stated inspiration for this game is The Thing, then allowing players to get familiar with environments and then changing them in subtle ways as players undergo movement or collectathon type puzzles would also do well to build the sense of paranoia that was so palpable in that stated influence. That lengthy rant was to say the Devil in Me systems have the potential to elevate Directive 8020 to be my favourite in the series, but they don't do that for the Devil in Me because they aren't fully realised yet. Having such an emphasis on movement and camera controls in a game about claustrophobic, inescapable environments full of tight, repeating corridors almost feels oxymoronic as a priority, like they developed these features because they can use them better in a later project and just wanted to test them here. This theoretically good but often uninspired gameplay loop is bogged down even further by a terrible number of bugs. I'll mention some more specific ones when I talk through my playthrough, but to give a brief list, this game features numerous overlapping assets, minor graphical corruption, sound issues, animation problems, and that's just the most noticeable things. Granted, I hear it was a lot worse at launch, but it's still not great. This game also has an uncanny, stilted vibe, which I can only assume was due to the constraints of recording during a COVID lockdown, although behind the scenes footage does show actors sharing a physical space, so I could be completely wrong here. The characters' line delivery often doesn't match each other in terms of tone, giving the game a very mismatched feeling. The strongest scenes are when characters are entirely in isolation, which isn't a good trait for a series that's lauded for its multiplayer. Character models are often uncanny too, which is true of all the games, but especially noticeable when paired with the double threat of this game's dialogue and line delivery.
Perhaps.
Of course, gameplay is always secondary to narrative within the DPA, so to shift the focus in this way was always going to be bold, and it falls flat as it leaves us with a half-finished system to explore a half-finished story. Once again, the components are clashing rather than complementing one another. Speaking of clashing components, this game also has collectibles called obels, which I couldn't fit anywhere else in this script. They can be used to purchase dioramas, which are just 3D models from the game in the bonus features. It's not a massively fleshed out system, you can't even get enough obels from one run to purchase all the dioramas, but it's also an entirely optional collectible with minimal impact, so it's neither good nor bad, it simply is. I don't care at all about obels. As with all the games, a relatively well-known face was brought into play the character on the box art, this time being Jessie Buckley who plays Kate. Jessie Buckley does a serviceable job here, but I've seen her do better elsewhere. She even did better in Men, which was another horror project she was involved in 2022, and I didn't even like that movie that much. This isn't her fault, it was her first time being in a video game and the direction doesn't seem too inspired, and Kate is also a bit of a nothing character. So, I'm sure she tried, but it just doesn't work for me. They also hired Paul Kaye, probably best known for playing Thoros of Myr in Game of Thrones, to play Charlie, and he gives the strongest performance in the cast, with Charlie being far and away the most expressive character with the widest range of visible emotions, so well done Paul Kaye. Charlie is my favourite character, and as with Tanya and Little Hope, he's the focus of the direction I would take the game in a rewrite, but even with all that praise, I still think he's just above average. Across the board, the acting can be described as fine, but the uninspired nature of the plot and writing in general leaves a lot to be desired. Speaking of uninspired plot, this game is largely inspired by the crimes of H.H. Holmes, often cited as America's first serial killer. To understand the game, we need to understand Holmes, so time for a bit more context.
On May 7th, 1896, Herman Mudgett, aka Henry H. Holmes, was sent to the gallows.
H.H. Holmes, real name Herman Webster Mudgett, which is a hilarious name, is a difficult figure to discuss because so much of his life is shrouded in sensationalism. The yellow journalism of his time makes it hard to tell with certainty the exact scope of his machinations. To put it into modern terms, imagine if the only news people had about Ted Bundy came from drama videos on YouTube. Holmes was honestly more interested in fraud than murder. He paid his own tuition to medical school with money he swindled from his first wife Clara. Holmes had numerous wives and mistresses across his life, and from all of them he extorted money, whilst also making loads of money from insurance scams. Despite having loads of cash from these big payouts, Holmes also had a habit of buying things on credit with no intention of paying them back. Whilst in popular memory Holmes is a notorious serial killer, it's honestly better to describe him as a scam artist who occasionally also killed people. H.H. Holmes is best known for his Murder Castle, a building he owned at the time of the 1893 World Fair in Chicago, a celebration of 400 years since Columbus landed in America. There's a lot of sensationalism around this building, with many stating that Holmes built this trap-filled labyrinth where he could kill people who came to this fair with these Saw-esque trap rooms. It's widely stated that he killed as many as 200 people during his time owning the building. A lot of this very probably isn't true. Holmes did kill people, but the number is massively inflated. He confessed to 27 murders, but some of these confessions were probably false. Some of the people he confessed to killing were even alive at the time of him confessing to killing them, and Holmes went back and forth a few times on exact numbers. So the real number is probably around 9 or 10, according to Adam Selzer, Chicago-based historian and author. Holmes did own a building in Chicago, yes, but the downstairs was shops and the second floor was long-term rental rather than a place for guests he could just dispose of. There was a planned third floor hotel, but this was never opened. Holmes did kill people in this building at least a few times, but what makes him interesting as a historical figure is just how utterly rife with misinformation his legacy is. In H.H. Holmes, The True History of the White City Devil, Selzer writes, "Right away I discovered that a major part of the story I thought I knew was wrong. Every article I'd read said the castle burned to the ground in 1895. In truth, there was a fire that year, but the building was still standing with the top 2 floors rebuilt for more than 40 years before it was finally razed, and papers spoke of it frequently in the early 20th century. An uncropped version of the most common photograph of it even shows a 1930s pickup truck near it." Separating fact from fiction turned out to be a tremendous task. It soon became apparent that Holmes's real story was very different from the story I had been told throughout the 20th century. Nearly all of the Holmes legend as we know it can be traced to 2 or 3 tabloid and pulp articles, and thousands of first-hand accounts, articles, witness statements and legal documents have been sitting unexamined, buried in microfilm reels and boxes of crumbling paperwork. I'm saying all of this now not just to give you a sense for the primary influence on this game, but because later it will become relevant when discussing the themes at play and how this game fails to capitalize on them. H.H. Holmes was a charismatic swindler. He also killed people, but in popular culture he's become this devilish boogeyman who haunts this labyrinthian murder maze, somewhere between a siren and a minotaur. So as a writer, you have a lot to play with here. The influence of Holmes as a mythologized figure rather than a person allows you to indulge in wild speculation, over-the-top violence, and you're tasked with creating a man so ineffably charismatic that he can get away with a frankly insane number of crimes, whilst charming the press into churning out pulp about him. He's the kind of person who captures the imagination. There are built-in themes when you tackle this figure, and centering your story around a documentarian team naturally brings to mind stories of misinformation, wild speculation, and misunderstanding. Holmes, by nature, has to be a figure with an innate charismatic aura to him, the kind of person who inspires real-world horror stories long after his death. Sadly, we do not see this in-game. All of the interesting things about H.H. Holmes have been gutted and completely sanitized over the course of The Devil in Me. With this context now established, let's begin talking about the game from its prologue and look at why it's so bad.
Goodness, this place is fit for a king.
Or my queen.
Oh, you. Kiss this.
Okay, let's go through everything, starting with the prologue. DPA entries usually have really tight prologues that set up the game's themes and central threat, but this game doesn't. Let's talk about what happens. The Devil in Me opens in the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago with newlywed couple Jeff and Marie checking into the World's Fair hotel owned by one H.H. Holmes. The two get promoted to a honeymoon suite, celebrate with some awkward flirting and a pillow fight, and then split up so Jeff can go downstairs and buy a shaving kit and Marie can take a bath. Jeff wanders down the hall and almost falls into a pit of spikes, revealing that an evil Fred Jones is at play in this hotel.
But it's just I love Nets so much. You don't have any idea of what they're made of and what they can mean to somebody.
Jeff rushes back to Marie to find that Holmes has already killed or at least badly wounded her, and here he can fight with Holmes or run away. Either way he dies, and the prologue ends with Holmes checking some new guests in. So if a prologue exists to introduce themes, characters, events or settings, what's the point of this prologue? These characters aren't reused, even the villain, who is woefully underutilized and mischaracterized. The events exist only to clue players in on who H.H. Holmes is. The setting isn't reused. The rest of the game takes place in a similar house but not the same one. So all I can assume is that this prologue is supposed to be an introduction of themes, but even then that's tenuous for reasons I'll go into shortly. This is far and away the worst prologue in the series. The game would honestly be better if it just skipped it, especially as the first proper chapter opens on a major character just expositing the history of H.H. Holmes to the camera.
America's first serial killer confessed to 27 murders. But as investigators sifted through the traces he left behind, following his path from city to city, the number grew significantly. Nearly 200 lives.
Everything we learned here was explained afterwards in a far more efficient way, which is a really confusing choice. An often throw around and broken by me writing rule is not to repeat yourself. So why explain everything again in a more concise way right after doing your lengthy intro? It would be like if I wrote a screenplay for something called Nero, the Monster in Rome, and Nero himself only shows up in a prologue before inexplicably vanishing. Then another character comes in, tells you his life story in a few sentences, and then the rest of the story is about some weirdo artist during the reign of Septimus Severus who has some of Nero's interests but is a totally different guy in a totally different time period. Ultimately, this prologue just left me with a bunch of questions as to why it was included at all, so here are some of those questions alongside lengthy answers that I hope will better explain my feelings on this introduction. Question 1. What am I supposed to take away from this thematically? Well, this prologue could be argued to introduce a number of themes that the game will iterate upon. It focuses on a newlywed couple, and many of the choices included within serve to characterize the pair's relationship with one another. So this prologue seems to be about just how far people will go to protect their loved ones, and how they reassess their relationships within life or death situations. Given the fact that 4 of the 5 characters in the core cast beyond this are couples, and the meta fact this game is designed to be played co-op first and foremost, I believe this is the central thing we're supposed to take away here. And this is the one thing I will praise this prologue for, although I feel it could have been more interesting to perhaps introduce some more obvious points of contention between Jeff and Marie before asking Jeff to decide if he wants to risk his life to save her or run away. We see the 2 major couples in this game struggle with conflict that makes their choices more conflicting. Jeff risking his life to save his wife who he adores does nothing but tell us stuff we already know about him. Jeff choosing to save his wife he suspects of being unfaithful or is in an unhappy marriage with or some other point of contention would be more drama and add dimension to this choice. Hell, they could characterize Holmes better here too. Having Marie flirt with him could be a way to show his charismatic appeal and make him less of an awkward weirdo. Whilst I personally don't like Jeff and Marie and find their interactions to be pretty stilted, they do serve as an introduction to this central theme, and the title will make a point to further explore this with Kate and Mark and Jamie and Erin. This is a serviceable introduction to a theme. It works fine, but it's nothing special. Another potential theme here is the desire to watch someone's last moments. This game makes frequent references to this, with Holmes encouraging Jeff to speak his mind to Marie before they both die, and clues throughout the game beyond the prologue showcasing that both Dumet and his inspiration Manny Sherman, both inspired by Holmes, are obsessed with the last moments of a person's life. They view it almost as a work of art and consistently chase the high of that specific moment, so showcasing Holmes' interest in it here works as a bit of setup. For the sake of talking about things chronologically, we'll get more into this later, but this prologue does introduce this as a theme, although it's not until much later that this will be explored properly. This is also fine. They don't need to explain everything or fully explore this theme immediately, and this works as an introduction. My issue with this is how poorly explored this theme is later on, but that is not a point against this prologue. So here we have two themes introduced, which can be argued to be the point of this prologue. I still don't like it, but that's a taste thing. For the sake of fairness, this stuff is a valid reason to include this prologue, and if you like it, I can understand why. Moving on to my second question. Question 2. Why H.H. Holmes? Prologues don't have to introduce themes. Hell, writing doesn't need themes. If you're not into all of this art school hogwash and you went to the Stephen King school of writing, then you can just play it entirely straight and tell a story about a crazy dude. But this story isn't really about H.H. Holmes, it's about a killer who was inspired by a killer inspired by H.H. Holmes, which makes you wonder why they don't skip the cue a bit here and just talk about one of those later killers. If this prologue isn't just about themes and is instead a setup to future events, it does very little to set things up compellingly. It should have focused on either of the two killers that were inspired by Holmes, not Holmes himself. These killers bear a surface level similarity to Holmes in terms of general MO, but there is no attention paid to the psyche of someone like Holmes and his most defining traits like his history as a scammer, his charisma, his million random occupations. They're all swept aside to tell you a generic watered down serial killer story about a bunch of bland characters with no deeper motives or personalities, because all of his copycats also lack this characterization. This game has 3 uninteresting killers rather than 1 interesting one. I believe this is because supermassive games fundamentally don't understand H.H. Holmes and so can't effectively utilize him as a quasi-mythological figure. The depiction of him we get here is why I brought up all of that context earlier, because it's not even remotely accurate. There was no hotel. There were very few murders that weren't carried out for specific reasons usually tied to insurance scams, and most importantly of all, Holmes wasn't this creepy weirdo. He was charismatic and outwardly friendly. He was able to seduce numerous women, and most people who met him found him to be incredibly agreeable. This game even features footage from a documentary called H.H. Holmes, America's First Serial Killer, which was released in 2005 and features outdated work from Harold Shater, who has since been heavily debated. The only reason to indulge in all of this sensationalism would be to hype up Holmes, leaning more into the pop culture interpretation of him than the actual history. But he doesn't even appear after the prologue, and many of his defining traits are absent from this depiction of him as well as his copycats. So much of this game is concerned with the aesthetics and mythos of Holmes to an almost fetishistic level, but it never wants to engage with him any deeper than the surface. Why use a real historical figure if you don't want to engage with that figure, and why drop him so quickly after setting him up just to throw a similar but different villain out? Here the studio has run the gambit of coming off insensitive by completely mythologizing a serial killer and ignoring all the facts about his life to make him a straight up villain like it's a Ryan Murphy show, only to disregard this almost immediately. Why even bother with the risk? This game's actual villain, a Holmes copycat by the name of Grantham Dumet, has so little similarities to Holmes outside of aesthetics that it makes me wonder why we open with Holmes at all. Why not just open with Dumet? It's not like Dumet appearing later in the game as a plot twist or anything. It's very apparent the cast are going to a murder castle, and allowing Dumet 2 confirmed kills on the prologue would do a lot to establish his threat, especially as in a playthrough where nobody dies, Dumet is routinely being outsmarted and beaten up by a cast of 50-year-old men and film students. In Scream, Friday the 13th, Halloween, and countless other iconic slasher films this game pulls influence from, the threat is clearly established within an opening scene similar to this one, and I can't help but feel that that would have been a good choice here. There's a golden opportunity to actually introduce our villain who is seriously wanting for some presence, but we just don't do it. This game has this pointless desire to teach players incorrect history about H.H. Holmes before it even starts, just to make sure you get all of the aesthetic references to him later. This game would work just as well without all of the information on Holmes. It's a complete waste of time. Booby-trapped murder castle is not a difficult concept to wrap your head around. You don't need to spend a full hour of a 5-hour game explaining the concept. Perhaps if Holmes was a more present threat, or if more of his traits were incorporated into Dumet, sure. But as it's so absent, the focus on Holmes feels wasted. I understand what they want to do with this character. They want to create this Jigsaw-esque master manipulator pulling the strings to murder victims trapped within this web. But I honestly feel if the prologue had shifted focus to Dumet, it would have been better for his characterization, as soon as this prologue ends we never see Holmes again, and we get an explanation on who he is in the scene right after, just so that the player can understand the killer in this game is copying H.H. Holmes. Set up our actual villain here. Previous DPA games have started with a prologue that features historical context. Both Man of Medan and House of Ashes did this, but in both cases these prologues also set up settings and threats that would be present in the future, not vaguely related threats and similar locations. This game's obsession with Holmes is bizarre, and it routinely damages the story and brings it to a grinding halt just to deliver information about a character that is only tenuously involved in the plot. Supermassive games feel so wrapped up in their own influences that they're scared of being their own thing. They don't make obvious or more compelling narrative choices because they're obsessed with making sure the players understand all of their references. They're pausing every few seconds to say, "Get it? Get it? Do you get what we did here?" This prologue doesn't set up that much by way of themes, anything to do with the actual plot, so what's left to it? It's just so they can make sure you understand what their reference is. Who cares? Question 3. Is The Devil in Me even about anything? As a big fan of Oscar Wilde, I'm totally on board with something having no deeper themes or just existing for its own sake. Aestheticism is a valid reason for art. Stuff can exist for no reason other than being cool and fun. Earlier when discussing the purpose of a work, I hope I made it clear that purpose can be as simple as just being fun or being good looking. I'm not so pretentious as to demand every work be Blood Meridian. Good art can be something as simple as a really nice painting that doesn't mean anything. But if that was the case, if this title is just a popcorn slasher with grindhouse influences, why isn't it more spectacle driven? Why not lean more into the bombast? If you don't want to get into deeper themes or character writing, then your work must live and die by its aesthetic leanings, and The Devil in Me doesn't have the chops for that. It lacks a stylistic identity that I haven't seen done better elsewhere. The deaths are pretty mundane. There's a lot more creativity with them in almost all of the prior entries. The most brutal and memorable death in this entire game was taken straight out of Until Dawn.
Oh, I love that shot the first time when it was in
Until Dawn.
A stated inspiration here is Saw, but Saw as a franchise revels in the spectacle. If this game wants to be Saw, then it should commit to that, delighting in the punishment of the cast. Devil in Me doesn't need to be as extreme as a Saw or a Terrifier, but simply leaning into over-the-top elements would honestly probably do a lot to increase the pure fun factor of this game, because as it stands it feels like it pulls punches. This is what I meant earlier when I said art is worse when it lacks confidence. This game feels unsure of itself. It always feels like it's holding itself back to make sure players understand what's going on, or to make sure they don't go too crazy and out there with their concept in case someone doesn't understand it or doesn't like it. Tom Heaton said in an interview that whilst an inspiration was Saw, they wanted to lean away from the torture porn elements of the series. I think that's a bad idea if you aren't going to replace it with anything else. Heaton says the game's moral dilemmas are supposed to fill this void, but there isn't enough meat on this game's bones to make me care about their characters or their stories or what the point of it is. Supermassive games usually write characters more as tropes than as people, and that works when they're plot vehicles and one-liner machines like in Until Dawn. It doesn't work if the characters have to carry the entire game with their inner dilemmas. You can't create a cast of slasher movie fodder stereotypes to act as bland player inserts and then expect me to care about the inner workings of their personal lives. I like Mario, but I don't care about how he'd solved the trolley problem. This game doesn't have the psychological chops to be anything but spectacle, so it should have lent harder into that or put more effort into realising these characters outside of their broad strokes archetypes. The villain of this game has a stated interest in capturing human emotions in a series of recordings, particularly towards the end of life, so why doesn't he try harder to push them to the edges of experience through more personalised fates? I'll touch more on this later, as I do have a proposed change to this game that I feel would better explore the concepts at play. In the end, even if you want to say just turn your brain off and enjoy it bro, there's hundreds of things I could do that with and enjoy more. I'm currently playing through Persona 3 Reload alongside working on videos, so I'm all for style over substance. I'm not above mindless entertainment, I make second monitor tier videos for YouTube.com. But if all you have is vibes, then the vibes have to be good. Rather than just bash this prologue, I want to offer a slightly changed version of it. You may dislike how I write things, and that's fine. I'm not an author beyond the hobbyist level, nor am I a game developer, but I feel like a more concise prologue that's more connected to the game's events would work well. How about we just make it about Du'Met from the jump and establish some menace, introduce the contradiction at the heart of this character. Du'Met has so much potential, and to understand that, let's jump ahead a bit and explain him, using clues found throughout this game to piece together his character and motives, and then talk about how they could be better used in my opinion. Grantum Du'Met has fans, so if you're one, please hear me out even though I'm about to massively annoy you. Du'Met is one of the worst written characters I've ever seen. He's emblematic of everything wrong with Supermassive's plot twist above all else writing style across this entire series. It feels like he was retconned and rewritten several times between each act of the game. Almost nothing about this character is consistent, and at times his motives and actions actively contradict one another. To explain this, let's talk through his entire story in chronological order. Why discuss this before the main plot of the game? Well, it's because everything about this character is learned through clues and additional information. As a character with personality, he doesn't exist in the narrative. Everything you can possibly learn about him is additional reading that you can completely skip. I absolutely hate this because Du'Met isn't some William Afton type background antagonist. He's actively interacting with the main cast for the entire game, but he has literally nothing to say. He has 0 lines of dialogue in the entire game. That would be fine if it wasn't for so much of his backstory being driven not by his physicality or threat, but by his mentality and charisma. On this channel, I try to avoid video essayist pitfalls like the term masterpiece, over-the-top hyperbole, using breaks you in the title of videos, but in this instance I have to break my own rule and ask, what happened to Show Don't Tell? To have the entire characterization of such an active player within your narrative be locked behind optional reading simply doesn't work in this instance. It can work in horror properties where the antagonist is less directly involved, but Du'Met isn't just a behind the scenes schemer, he's an active threat and somebody with a lot of screen time. So to completely obfuscate all of his personality is a very strange choice to say the least. Grantum Du'Met, the antagonist of this game, is actually a guy called Hector Monday. After a life of relentless bullying from his peers and neglect and abuse from his mother, who was his sole caregiver, he developed violent tendencies but was able to suppress them for most of his developmental years and early adult life. In 1988, Monday graduated with a degree in psychology and he went on to get a job in the FBI. Less than a decade later, in 1997, he had progressed enough to lead the FBI in the investigation and arrest of Manny Sherman, nicknamed the Beast of Arkansas, a serial killer. During interviews with Sherman, Monday found something of a kindred spirit, with Sherman inspiring in Monday both an interest in H.H. Holmes and a desire to nurture his dormant sadistic tendencies. During this time, Monday's mother Lucinda was dying of lung cancer, and under Sherman's influence, Monday murdered his own mother whilst recording his final few visits with her so that he could later exhume her corpse and turn her into an animatronic that repeated the final few conversations of her life. Sherman describes the greatest thrill in life being the final moment of someone else's, so it seems Monday had internalized this and looked to capture the end of life in a kind of macabre art piece. Following this, Monday lived a double life as a serial killer and the investigator investigating himself, being dubbed the Shoeshine Killer. Realizing he would soon be discovered, Monday faked his own death in a fire and adopted the persona of Grantum Du'Met, a Holmes-esque savant and con artist. Again, all of this is just a reference to Holmes, we don't actually see any of this skill or artistry in the game. Around this time, Monday digs up the body of the now deceased Sherman and turns him into an animatronic, showcasing that his art pieces aren't just people he killed, but also people he feels an affinity for. This actually does a lot in theory to characterize Dumet as more sentimental than he perhaps seems. Shortly after this, Dumet meets the wealthy couple Mark and Jennifer Edwards, who own an island in Lake Michigan and plan to open a health spa. Dumet is so beloved by this couple that following their deaths, it's revealed that they have left him everything they own. Following this, Dumet gets super into H.H. Holmes, builds the murder castle, and goes on to murder 178 people prior to the events of the game proper. His primary manner of murder is to trap people within the house and then have them pick each other off through a series of complex moral choices before becoming more directly involved as a threat. He seems to revel in the complex emotions this causes in people, likely as this creates better emotional canvases for his animatronics. Dumet is in the awkward position of allegedly being some super intelligent, incredibly well-spoken serial killer. He's capable of faking his own death and fully reinventing himself. He acquired his murder house for a Mr. Ripley-esque scheme where he endeared himself to the prior owners. He still cares for their cat. He shows a sentimental side through his choice of who he builds his most elaborate dioramas out of, and throughout the game you can find business cards showcasing that much like Holmes, Dumet was both a savant and a con artist with numerous professions and skill sets. But at the same time, he has to be this silent, hulking robot with no personality that just wanders around the house aimlessly attacking people. I say robot intentionally here, as Dumet's whole deal is that he likes building animatronics, and in one scene of the game we find out he has numerous replicas of himself that use the exact same model as him. Not animatronics that look like him, literally just his model copy and pasted. Coupling this with his ability to survive literally exploding after crashing into a giant rock in one of the game's endings, it's pretty clear that at some point within development, the idea of Dumet, at least the Dumet we see, being a robot was played around with. Except Dumet can't be a robot. For one thing, no other animatronic he makes is anywhere near as dynamic and lifelike as he is. On top of that, he very clearly feels pain and can be slowed down. At one point he gets hit by skinny middle-aged man Charlie, and that's enough to slow him down so everyone can escape from him. Dumet routinely looks incompetent, in fact, far more so than he should be. In numerous scenes due to bugs, you can leave your light on whilst you hide from him, and he's unable to find someone pointing a flashlight directly into his face. This honestly feels like the writers were in opposition with one another as to what exactly Dumet is. The people writing the clues and the people writing the actual game didn't agree on things because his backstory and his presentation are so starkly different. There's even a scene in game, if you find enough clues, where the characters awkwardly recount Dumet's entire backstory to him and ask him to stop, and he just ignores it.
It's a cycle of violence. You can break that cycle.
This scene alone showcases the disconnect between Dumet the idea and Dumet the character. They can't coexist within this scene because they're so far removed from one another. When confronted with the potential to be a more realized character, the Dumet present within the devil in me just feels weaker for it. This man, who is so ineffably charismatic that a wealthy couple gave him everything they owned, has 0 lines of dialogue, and this sentimental killer who feels a strong attachment to his past doesn't react when confronted on it. This is especially bad as Monday is clearly shown to be someone who is heavily influenced by others' opinions on him and someone who is deeply affected by his past, so to have literally no reaction when confronted on these things is bad. Dumet keeps photograph and macabre art pieces of his victims, as well as people who have massively influenced him, like his mother, Sherman, and the Edwards. He feels like a ghost haunting his own memories, so to be confronted for this and do absolutely nothing is a waste. It should prompt the more wistful and romantic side of Dumet. He shouldn't stop being a killer or say, "Sorry guys, my bad," or anything like that. But to see him express more emotion would work wonders for his efficacy as a character, especially when he's so one-dimensional. There's an implicit sadness to Dumet, a man who is defined entirely by his past. His motive for everything is eternal preservation. He wants to exist in a permanent stagnation and build a collection of memories he can exist within. But this implicit sadness is never anything more than implied. Honestly, they should have cut this confrontation scene, as it's just another instance of characters loudly stating the plot and what's going on, and in this instance it actively damages the characterization of Dumet as it runs contrary to everything we're told about him. There's actually a fan theory that Dumet is two people because so much of what he does isn't possible or is actively contradictory. I don't subscribe to this personally, but I think it would be more interesting if the writers did go this way, as it would help out a lot with the internal contradictions. Dumet simply can't be one person. On top of this, the writers at Supermassive are obsessed with plot twists, to the point Dumet does things that don't make any sense just to shock an audience he shouldn't be conscious of. In numerous scenes, when the characters arrive on the island, a figure in a yellow raincoat can be seen stalking the group who is clearly Dumet. We even see scenes where he isn't anywhere near the group and he wears this disguise. This is so later, the person in the yellow coat can be revealed to be an animatronic in one of the game's first moral choices, except they clearly aren't an animatronic in these early scenes. The group can see him in this outfit exactly once, but he's not trying to be seen. And it's Kate who sees him, not Charlie, who is the character tied to the dilemma with the raincoat animatronic. For the most part, this is for the benefit of the player, meaning Dumet went to the effort to fabricate this persona purely for an audience he couldn't possibly know exists. There's an argument to be made that this is for anonymity or to set up a later moral choice, but if it was the first, he shouldn't wear bright yellow in such a washed out place, and he wears a mask later on anyway. And if it's the latter, he should make more effort to be seen by all members of the Scooby Gang if he's going to be jump scaring them later. The concept of a character getting changed into their villain outfit to hype themselves up between scenes doesn't really give me Michael Myers vibes either, it's more like Megamind. I'll return to this raincoat character a bit more in my suggested rewrite, so stick with me here. In-game, Dumet also keeps the person alive at the end of each cycle to pretend to be him and have them lure others in, but this is also bad and comes off as twist first, sense second writing. Partly this is because using a scared person reading off a script as a lure instead of your own implied natural charisma comes off as off-putting. We see this in-game, and honestly it feels like it would just lower the success chance of getting people to come to your murder house. Over the course of a playthrough, Dumet will kill this lore person, and then everyone else escapes, so he has to start another cycle without fake Dumet, and he's completely capable of it, which really makes you question why he even bothers. On top of that, Dumet likes to have full control over situations. He likes to curate dioramas of people's lives, so why not just show his face and use his allegedly good people skills to further manipulate the people he lures in? It's not like he expects any of them to escape and leak his identity, and even when that does happen in a potential ending, he just keeps going and nothing happens. He uses a fake Dumet because people playing The Devil in Me will go, "Whoa," when they realise the guy they meet at the ferry isn't Dumet. It's so painful when you can tell a writing decision has been made, not because it seems like something a character would do or something that makes sense in the story, but rather because it will make a moment for the audience. It feels cheap and manufactured, and Supermassive games are full of moments like this. I think that's enough for now on Dumet, but I'll talk more about specific moments later, so on to my proposed changes. Why not just make the prologue about Dumet and make Dumet two people? Maybe not two people per se, as Hector Monday is such an individual, but have the groundskeeper in the raincoat be the friendly Dumet persona he uses to enthrall people and invite them over, and have the big hulking animatronic be the killer. This establishes Dumet as a threat, whilst also allowing two facets of the character to be explored. You can have both the hulking physical threat and the charismatic savant coexist this way. A lot of fan theories already imply that this kind of thing is going on, so just do that. This prologue can play out basically the same with Jeff and Marie coming to stay in a newly built spa or being invited like any of the other characters in prior cycles. This runs the risk of having the audience be too clued in on Dumet being a villain, but there doesn't actually need to be a plot twist here. and allowing him a Josh from Until Dawn type fake out death during one of his manufactured dilemmas later on would cause them to question this assertion anyway. So if you really want to have a plot twist, you can create a double bluff red herring here. Assuming we keep Jeff and Marie about as characters, this prologue can play out exactly the same beat for beat with a few minor changes to tie it closer to the game's actual plot. All of the benefits can be kept, and we can strengthen it by making it more relevant. In the game as it exists, early in the prologue, Jeff and Marie can stumble into a room with a body of a victim of Holmes. If they're in Dumet's murder castle, it could instead be a partially constructed animatronic of one of them, foreshadowing Dumet's desire to capture them into these machines. Assuming the deaths and choices play out exactly the same, everything is just better. Showing as much of the animatronics as possible is also really funny because if a player doesn't find any clues, they'll never learn what the point of these things even are and just think them to be a quirky novelty. However, to take things a step further, I would have this entire prologue be from the point of view of Mark and Jennifer Edwards, a couple who are trying to build a spa on an island and receiving help from Dumet, who is a close friend of theirs, before they are brutally murdered by the Dumet animatronic. This naturally creates questions in the player when they arrive, such as why the spa that they saw in the prologue is now a H.H. Holmes murder mansion. Why Dumet, who could be introduced as a kindly family friend, now runs the place, and what the deal with these robots is. I feel this would be in keeping with more conventional slasher intros while having a more direct through line to the plot and making players ask questions without giving too much away. Thematically, it touches on the same themes as the pre-existing prologue but updates them to be more relevant. I won't bore you with a line-by-line rewrite like I did in Little Hope, but I feel a shift in focus similar to this would work wonders. Of course, this would mean Dumet has killed less than 10 people at the start of the game instead of the almost 200 he's sitting on during the first act. But honestly, there's no reason for the number to be this high other than to have another factually incorrect H.H. Holmes reference. Let me know what you'd change though, always happy to see creative writing essays in my comment sections, and I know that my own writing is not infallible. This was a really long section on the shortest section of the game, but to me a prologue ought to set the tone to keep people interested, so it warranted lengthy discussion. A prologue is one of the most important things. Why do you think my intros are so long? Moving past that, let's kick up the pace and talk about the actual game as it begins with Act 1.
Sorry, do you start with qualifications or, like personnel info? Because will anyone access this? I'm kind of private, actually.
Act 1 begins with all of the characters looking directly at the camera and stating their job and motivations, except my game bugged and main character Kate's audio didn't work. Luckily for me, these characters will tell you their entire deal almost every line of dialogue from this point onwards, so this bug doesn't really change anything. Usually, and for the remainder of this game, I'd bash characters just outright stating who they are and what they're about, but this serves the dual purpose of showing us the characters are being watched and studied, and it makes sense as they're a documentary crew working on a project and sending out tapes that describe what they do to networks. No writing technique is inherently bad, context matters. Our main cast consists of Kate, the presenter, Mark, the camera guy, Jamie, the lighting technician, Erin, the sound engineer, and Charlie, producer and true British geezer. The group, who all work for Charlie's company, Lonnet Entertainment, are working on a series called Architects of Murder and are struggling to make an episode on H.H. Holmes. As mentioned earlier, there's a lot of speculation on Holmes and not much actual concrete evidence, so this makes sense. Charlie gets a call from a guy called Grantham Dumet who offers them a free trip to his house, which also happens to be a 1-to-1 recreation of the H.H. Holmes murder castle in the middle of Lake Michigan. Charlie accepts this deal, which is fair enough as he's struggling, but as a player it's really hard to understand why everyone else gives up their free time to go immediately to what is very obviously a Scooby-Doo murder mansion, especially as they don't really seem to like Charlie that much. I can believe it with Erin and Mark because it seems like they have nothing else going on in their life, but Jamie seems to actually have friends and Kate is actively looking for work elsewhere. I'd understand if Dumet pulled the Holmes influence and was charismatic, but over the phone he sounds shaky and unreliable, not the kind of source most people would trust. There's a reason as to why he sounds this way. It's the focus of the earlier mentioned fake Dumet plot twist that goes nowhere. But honestly, I'd rather Dumet be a long-time source of Charlie's and someone he feels he can trust rather than a random cold caller. This shows Dumet to be more meticulous and sadistic, and it serves to further create a rift between Charlie and everyone else. As mentioned earlier, the real Dumet was an FBI investigator and someone who tends towards very long-term plots with a lot of planning. It's easy to believe he could build rapport with people long before he puts his plans to murder them into action. That's literally how he got his murder house. On top of that, a focus of this game is relationships in pairs, and Charlie and Dumet being close confidants prior to the game, even if Dumet is entirely faking it, would open up thematic and narrative avenues to explore his and Charlie's relationship. They are two individuals who view themselves as artists and who others often dismiss, especially as Dumet is sentimental and shaped by the influence of Sherman, so might feel a desire to act as a kind of artistic mentor to someone like Charlie, who he sees some of himself in. Charlie being more fully on board with Dumet's plan, not just out of desperation but out of a desire to work with a long-term confidant and someone he trusts, would also give him more reason to go against the group when things start to go wrong later on. This game tries to set up a rift between Charlie and everyone else, but for reasons we'll discuss later, this doesn't work, and they could have set the scene here a lot better by having Charlie and Dumet know each other prior to the game. Now, current Dumet can't do any of this, because he's one of those survivors kept around to shock the players we talked about earlier. He's not actually Dumet, he's a guy Dumet has making telemarketing calls for him. But as I mentioned earlier, this is a pointless detail. It could have been cut out of the game, and everything would be better for it. The biggest piece of evidence for me being this dismissive is that you can end the game with Dumet not having a telemarketer on payroll, and he just carries on doing his thing anyway. Anyway, the group show up to the island, Charlie and Mark explore it to get an opening shot to the documentary and climb up to a lighthouse. This showcases the changes to movement and is fun in the moment even if these controls quickly run their course. There's a fun jump scare with a featureless animatronic that's been discarded out in the wild. I like the symmetry of these two climbing to the lighthouse at the start and at the end of a playthrough where they both live, and the foreshadowing of a somber solo climb for Mark if Charlie dies. Mark climbs up this lighthouse at the start and the end of the game. Mark and Charlie have a fun relationship as Mark is torn between his affection for Kate, who doesn't like Charlie, and his respect for Charlie, who he views as a kind of mentor. No major notes here, this is fun as a tutorial and sets up a good if underutilized relationship. It's similar to when Nick and Abby walk around the camp at the start of The Quarry. Kate and Jamie can also explore here. They have a really weird relationship, as Jamie allegedly doesn't like Kate and is really close with Mark, with Kate and Mark being recently broken up. But Jamie and Kate share loads of screen time, and there's almost never any real tension between them. Later in the game, Jamie can literally press a kill Kate button not once but twice. In fact, to get the good ending where everyone lives, she has to press this button at least once, and Kate doesn't even seem that mad about it. During this segment, the group meet the guy who's pretending to be Dumet, and he's very clearly shaky and unstable. This is because he isn't Dumet, he's a blackmailed victim from the last cycle called Morello. Again, this twist is bad. This character comes off as off-putting, I wouldn't trust him or enter his house. As soon as the characters are in the house, he leaves and is killed off-screen by Dumet. This is another instance of someone in Supermassive coming up with an idea that they think will be a cool plot twist, and all it really does is require you further suspend your disbelief that the main cast, especially the competent people like Kate and Jamie, would trust someone who is this clearly insane. Inside the hotel, we're introduced to our other major romantic pairing in this game, which is Jamie and Erin. Erin is a massively underutilized character, but the contrast of Dumet's approaches to traumatizing an established relationship like Kate and Mark and a blossoming relationship like Jamie and Erin is interesting, I guess. The problem is that we don't really see this relationship develop, which is really bad given that, as stated earlier, a theme I think they're trying to explore here is reassessments of relationships in life or death situations, but in order to reassess something we need to have a strong foundation, and almost no foundation is laid here. Later on, Dumet tries to stir the pot between them by planting a phone with text from Jamie about how she finds Erin kind of annoying, but this doesn't really cause that big of a rift between the two because petty text exchanges really do not recontextualize things when you're being chased by a serial killer. If anything, Dumet trying to engage in this high school level drama between these two people who he's apparently been studying for a long time is just ridiculously funny. He's got like a burn book. He's like Regina George. The fault isn't with Jamie. I find Jamie pretty reasonable across this entire game. She's probably the most grounded character. The problem is with Erin. Erin is a character who feels designed to die, which is an issue across the series. Usually in these you determine who survives type games, if a character has a potential death scene and survive it, they have almost nothing to do afterwards, as the developers likely don't want to prioritize scenes or more developed plot lines with a character only half of the players will have. This is very apparent with Erin, who always feels like she's an extra who's just been edited into scenes she shouldn't be in the latter half of the game. If you put some of these scenes side by side, she literally looks like she's just been edited in post. She's fine for Act 1, but I mention this now because as soon as we hit Act 2, there's minimal mention of Erin. So her relationship with Jamie, her relationships with the entire cast really, feel massively underutilized. Erin is a character designed to die. Erin and Jamie awkwardly flirt for a bit, before Erin goes to help Charlie find cigarettes. Charlie and Erin's dialogue isn't too interesting, but we see more of Charlie's arrogant belief that he's this visionary artiste despite the fact he's running a floundering company with no successes to his name. Again, a potentially interesting parallel to Dumet, which isn't developed at all. Charlie can go to a bar here and be served by an animatronic barman in what looks like a reference to The Shining. The barman calls him Mr. Dumet, again showing a parallel between the two, and Dumet can be seen watching Charlie as he tries to get cigarettes from a broken cigarette dispenser, showcasing a more playful kind of sadism from the killer. This scene is good, really good in fact, as it characterizes Charlie and Dumet, sets up parallels between the two, and shows a concerted effort from Dumet to try and psychologically break Charlie outside of life or death choices with more minor inconveniences. This scene also shows Charlie for what he really is, an unstable and desperate man with an inflated sense of self-importance who will resort to criminal means to further his own desires. This is good setup for later on when evidence is planted to imply that Charlie might be the one behind all of this. I believe at some point in development there was maybe plans to have a more developed pairing or relationship between Dumet and Charlie, with Charlie being the character closest to Dumet and a character Dumet pays a lot of attention to. He's the one he singles out to call, he's the one who follows him around for most of the start of the game. Charlie is the first person he put into one of his moral dilemmas. Credit where credit's due, Charlie is really well characterized throughout Act 1. This is legitimately interesting to watch, and crucially the game feels a lot more like a slasher with a dark sense of humour as we see obvious fodder characters like Charlie get stalked as he fights with a cigarette machine and screams at a robot. I wish the entire game kept this tone instead of becoming as self-serious as it does. One of the most charming elements of Until Dawn that I feel supermassive games have failed to recapture as it goes on is this kind of darkly comedic side of things. Meanwhile, Mark and Kate parkour around the hotel before dinner and talk about their relationship. This scene isn't as good, but it introduces a H.H. Holmes animatronic, further showing Dumet's interest in Holmes. This game is about to completely drop H.H. Holmes as a plot point, so this feels like another get it moment. A funny detail here is that Dumet purchased H.H. Holmes' actual hat on credit, which he never intends to pay back, and the guy selling it was somehow not aware that this was a signature move of Holmes. Again, it can be pretty good as a dark comedy when it wants to be, but only in Act 1. Charlie shows up and gives this scene a point at the end as he can eavesdrop on the pair and grow irate that they're planning on moving on from his business even though everyone knows that Lonnet Entertainment is failing, showing his possessive nature and how attached he feels especially to Mark. What could be a scene about Kate and Mark is actually once again about Charlie because he's a more interesting character. In fact, as slasher fodder goes, Charlie is honestly S tier because he has a clearly defined motivation to stick around in the sketchy situation that nobody else has. Even if Charlie survives this, he's got a failing business and the pressure of a network to deliver on. He also has defined character traits and realistic flaws that not only inform his behaviour but also drive his actions, such as his smoking addiction and his narcissism. Furthermore, all the characters are tied together through their relationships to Charlie, and the group's in-jokes about things like his prior failings at Topeka are fun moments of characterization for all of them and helps them feel more realised. It's crazy how much of the character work in this game is carried by Charlie, and this isn't all I have to say about him, but for now let's move on. The Scooby Gang regroup in the dining hall after a cutscene of Dumet building some animatronics. At dinner, Jamie reveals that fake Dumet has left, and Charlie has the option to either be normal or be really antagonistic for no reason, which is funny. I like when games let you play as a crazy person who just annoys everyone.
Dumet? Yeah, that dude ain't coming.
Charlie convinces the group to stay and finish their documentary, driving the plot once again, and Mark and Kate have a "do you think he heard us earlier" conversation, even if he directly confronted them and made it clear he did, which is one of many little writing oversights that add to the unpolished and unfinished vibe of this game. After dinner, Erin has a really effective horror section in the game's best usage of the inventory and personalised items. Erin's unique item allows her to hear through walls, and this leads to a segment where she follows sounds through the walls before finding herself in a blacked out room and starts having an asthma attack. This segment uses sound really effectively and utilises the claustrophobic feel of the hotel to its advantage. Erin's asthma had also been set up earlier, so this doesn't come out of nowhere and feels like Dumet has studied her and tailored a situation that takes advantage of her job and her illness to attack her personally. Maybe this game's actually good. I should maybe change the title. Maybe it's just Act 1 though. In the dark room, Dumet offers Erin her inhaler, which is strong characterization for him as he doesn't want to just murder Erin here. He wants to keep her alive for a later moral dilemma for Jamie, and scare her so she has more content for an animatronic. However, he will kill her if she attacks and injures him, showing his brutality and a vengeful streak. Erin is rescued if she survives here, and the group make a plan to leave whilst Charlie and Jamie try to find Dumet, ending Act 1. In Act 2, whilst the group wander about the hotel, Charlie is forced into the first of Dumet's moral dilemmas when he stands on the pressure plate in front of the man in the yellow coat who is trapped beneath a blade. If Charlie stays standing on the pressure plate, Dumet will cut him, but if he steps off it, the guy in the coat will die. If Charlie is cut, he doesn't die, he steps back and the man in yellow is killed, either way that happens. The purpose of this scene is twofold: to force a choice from Charlie, which is Dumet's MO, but also to show Charlie as a killer to Jamie, as Dumet will later plant evidence incriminating Charlie. Dumet has spliced together audio from calls with Charlie to make him seem like he's involved in the murders and left them around the hotel for the crew to find. So showing him to be willing to kill, even if indirectly, in front of Jamie is more evidence of this. This is the one intelligent thing Dumet does. But that alone isn't all of the layers here. At this point in the game, there is a commitment to showing Charlie as being someone Dumet has an interest in. Dumet is always seen following Charlie, and watching him more intently than the other characters. His animatronics refer to Charlie as Dumet. The two both view themselves as artists. Hell, both of them even leave business cards lying around like they're at some kind of networking event. Dumet himself had a mentor in Sherman, so perhaps he wishes to test Charlie here. He injures him if he doesn't show a killer instinct because that is disappointing. There's a lot of interesting ideas here that just aren't expanded upon, and I think this is a good time to talk about protagonist/antagonist foils and how supermassive games just don't use this concept.
Please, you fucking bastard!
Supermassive games don't ever make the most of narrative foils. I spoke about this briefly when I covered Man of Medan, a game that features Olsen and Alex, two characters that are driven by greed and social advancement who actively neglect their loved ones, including their less confident little brothers, in pursuit of Manchurian gold. Over the course of this game, these two near identical characters have almost no interaction, and what exactly the difference between them isn't explored at all, even though they have the potential for the most interesting dynamic of that game. These are characters who fundamentally want the same things and have the same outlook coming into opposition, a prime opportunity to talk about what the writers view as being the main difference in motive that separates them. Why is Alex a hero and Olsen a villain? Well, it's because we play as Alex and Olsen is crazy. This question being centered would serve to characterize both characters as well as being a driving force of the plot. I don't need to tell you just how effective a good villain is for driving player engagement. There are people on this platform who have paid off their mortgages just by dissecting interesting villains. In The Devil in Me, this is apparent with Charlie and Dumet. I don't want to repeat myself too much, and I think I've explained the similarities already, but I need to state why this is a failure, and why not capitalizing on this dynamic is so bad. First of all, this is a game about complex moral decisions causing people to reassess their relationships with a particular emphasis on pairings. Every character that isn't Charlie has a clearly defined paired character that the game wants to develop them alongside, whilst Charlie's dilemmas are always between him and a robot. Dumet is everything Charlie wants to be. He's a legitimately talented artist, he's also charismatic, and Dumet notices this as Charlie is the person he identifies to reach out to, as well as being the character he most intently watches throughout Act 1. This begs the question as to why Dumet wants Mark to be the guy to replace him as the fake Dumet when Charlie is such an obvious option. I suppose it's because he can't blackmail Charlie with a loved one, but there's so many ways to manipulate Charlie, and Dumet's aware of them. I can't help but feel that things would be more interesting if, rather than trying to frame Charlie to the group, Dumet legitimately wanted to create something of an acolyte in Charlie in the same way Manny Sherman influenced him and H.H. Holmes influenced Sherman. This game has an obsession with cycles and reincarnation. The title is a reference to the devil being reborn through corrupt individuals, so a Dark Charlie route would tie everything together way more than the existing bad ending of Dumet hiring more recruitment consultants. This change would not only add a thematic cohesion between all of this background lore and the events of the game, but also adds more drama to playing as Charlie, giving him moral choices where he can sacrifice his own team in exchange for money or the promise of wealth, or to protect his own image if Dumet had some dirt on him. In single player runs, this kind of thing would be interesting to roleplay, and in co-op it would be frankly hilarious to have your partner just kill you for a pouch of obels. It's a shame Supermassive have moved away from more antagonistic co-op runs since Man of Medan. In his dossier on Lonnet Entertainment, Dumet has identified Charlie as being a potential narcissist, and his background in psychology and in the FBI should allow him to better manipulate this than just trolling him with a cigarette machine. Early on, what I'm suggesting seems to be the direction that the game's going in. As stated earlier, there's obvious references to The Shining that cast Charlie in the role of Jack. He's consistently shown in opposition to the members of the crew from the jump, and he's shown to be violent and unstable. However, shortly after this first dilemma is thrust on him, Charlie panics, falls through the floor, and either dies or is out of commission for most of the runtime, after which he just becomes a passive follower right the way until the finale. He gets the Erin treatment. This would be bad enough, but Dumet kills Charlie before the group can even find evidence incriminating him, which completely runs contrary to his stated motivation of trying to capture myriad emotions to put into his animatronics. He doesn't even let Charlie interact with the group after framing him, so what's the point? For the sake of transparency, I should say if Charlie survives, Dumet can get his wish. The group do confront Charlie and can leave him to be killed, but this is very late in the game and it feels anticlimactic. This is why I stated earlier that the game should just have it both ways and have Dumet be an actual character alongside the hulking robot he uses for murders, and he should be someone Charlie has a long-time correspondence with. It would allow Dumet to more effectively manipulate Charlie and the group through him. It also showcases him to be meticulous and ties into his background as being someone who does long-term investigations on people. To return to my earlier Prologue Rewrite, I would have the human Dumet continue to be an active character, and to further confuse players to his nature, I'd actually have him be playable in co-op and Curator's Cut as a kind of minor protagonist. Friendly and overly kind to the characters, but occasionally a choice will pop up to just kill someone. I would also frequently pair him up with Charlie and have him be able to convince him that the group are conspiring against him. There's already the plot point of Kate trying to move on from the company, so driving Charlie to a kind of madness would be an interesting arc to explore. This is just one idea, but I think in general Supermassive should strive to make their villains more interesting. They should make them playable from time to time to spice up gameplay and give the series more tension in co-op, and it just adds more variety to a very stagnant series. They're very conscious of how stagnant it is. I think this is a direction that could be good. I'm sure some of you have all kinds of ideas as to where a story with a more active Dumet Charlie foil could go, and that's the point of this section, to showcase just how underutilized both Charlie and Dumet are, even though they're such an obvious pairing in a game that places so much emphasis on pairs. Throughout Act 1, Charlie is the most compelling character, the only person who even wants to be there, and a more defined relationship with Dumet would only make him more interesting. You can flavour this, or imagine it however you like, but the fact of the matter is it would work wonders for his characterisation. But we don't take that route. As I stated before, he falls through the floor and dies, or has all of his personality cooked out of him in a big oven, only to show up again at the end of the game and do sweet FA. Whilst Charlie's in the oven, Erin gets captured or is killed by Dumet. Shortly thereafter, Kate is also captured and Jamie has to choose who she wants to save as the air is slowly removed from each of the rooms these two are being kept in. The correct choice is to kill Kate, as she's on the box art of the game so can't die until later. Choosing her will see Mark come to the rescue, whilst choosing Erin will just kill Erin. The game's inventory actually tricked me here, as I picked Erin thinking she could survive with no oxygen because she had an inhaler. In retrospect, this is really stupid. Inhalers are not a substitute for oxygen at all. You can't breathe in space with an inhaler. From here, the remaining group make a plan to go to the lighthouse before they all get separated. Mark, much like his idol Charlie, falls down a hole, and the girls make their way over to a big control room and have a chase scene with Dumet. Mark has a fun segment in a workshop where the new hide mechanic is used pretty well to create tension as he sneaks about the bowels of the hotel before escaping the hotel and meeting up with Charlie. This is assuming Charlie is alive. Prior to this, he could have died in the oven or in an industrial shredder, which is done way better in Until Dawn in one of Best Girl Emily's deaths. The girls do some exploration and we find out that Dumet is trying to torment them with clues from their past. The strangest of these is that Kate's best friend was killed by another serial killer when she was younger, because this is never brought up again, nor does it really inform her character. Kate is such a confusing protagonist because I literally could not tell you a single thing about her which informs her actions. In the behind the scenes interview with Buckley, she also struggles to quite articulate what Kate's deal is, and it seems in every chapter in the game there's a new motivation being thrown at her to see what sticks. She feels like a first draft character. At the start of the game, she's looking for footage for her showreel because she wants to move to a new company. Then she wants to rekindle with Mark. Then she's super into being a detective because her friend was murdered. Then she's back to wanting to get with Mark. Then she's into crystals for a bit. None of her traits really seem that consistent, and her motives seem ever changing. We never really learn who she is, despite the fact that Kate, more so than any other character, just talks directly to the camera about what her deal is. In her opening speech, she talks about how she's honest and everyone is so mean to her because of that. But she's just as duplicitous as any of the other characters in the cast. She's not that much more honest than Erin or that much more honest than Mark. Kate is a terrible main character to center the game around because she has so little in the way of defining traits. Either center Charlie or give Kate more to do. In fact, Jamie is honestly a better protagonist choice. She's got a very clear personality, opposes Charlie directly, and is the character who pushes the hardest to get out as soon as things start going wrong. Jamie probably has the most defined relationships with the entire cast alongside Charlie. She works for him, she's got a love interest in Erin, a friendship with Mark, and a rocky friendship with Kate. Her close proximity to the entire group makes her an easy character to center moral decisions around. Jamie is the only character who Dumet has choose between two individuals to die, which means she has all of the most interesting decisions to make. If you can only play as one character in this game, you want to play as Jamie because all of the moral dilemmas fall to her. Save for a fake one with Charlie and a completely situational one with Mark. Jamie's highly opinionated and headstrong personality also makes her well equipped to handle these situations and makes her responses interesting. In fact, as we move into Act 3 and every character's personality starts getting more and more stripped away in service of ending this game, Jamie remains the most consistent. After a chase scene, Jamie and Kate end up in another trap past this where a glass pane is slowly advancing towards Jamie and she can press a button to send it towards Kate. The correct choice is to send the glass towards whoever you've given a screwdriver earlier in the playthrough. Again, this is good as it rewards the player for remembering their own choice and makes use of the new mechanics to add a dimension to said choice. The game drew enough attention to the screwdriver earlier when you choose who takes it, but not so much that it's a completely obvious Chekhov's gun. This is a good segment. Act 2 ends on a high, and we move on to the game's final act. Act 3 starts with the girls running away from or fighting Dumet on the roof. The QTEs here sometimes overlap and fail without you having a chance to do anything about it. Unfortunately, I didn't get footage, but this happened at least twice on my playthrough, so you'll just have to trust me here. They go to a maze and solve some puzzles before being attacked by Dumet as he emerges from that weird corridor of identical clones that are never brought up again I mentioned earlier in his section. Why are these here? I don't know, maybe he collected a lot of obels and wanted to show off his 3D models. The group then hang out with a dog called Connie for a bit before heading to the lighthouse pursued by Dumet where they meet Mark and maybe Charlie if he's alive. The group then have to escape from Dumet. If the player has enough clues, they will also do that terrible confrontation scene I mentioned a while ago. As the group activates the lighthouse and rush to the pier, Salim from House of Ashes shows up and threatens to make this game good, so Dumet kills him. The Scooby Gang get on a boat, have a final fight with Dumet and escape. This is the ending of Act 3, assuming all or most of your characters survive. There's another ending where only Mark and Kate survive up to the lighthouse scene. In this instance, Kate is kept as a hostage and Mark is made to act as the fake Dumet to lure in another group of 5, the same way Morello did before him. Whether you go along with this or not, the couple both die. Much like Jeff and Marie before them, Mark and Kate don't have much in the way of a developed relationship, so putting them in this horrific situation is upsetting, but I don't feel enough attachment to care all that much. I care slightly more than Jeff and Marie, but I wish we saw more of Mark and Kate together. They spend most of the latter half of the game separated. Either way, the good ending sees Dumet fly into a rock, explode, and then somehow survive and keep doing his plan without fake Dumets, proving that he is an invincible robot, and all of that stuff he did with fake Dumets was for nothing. So, for all the things I enjoyed, I hope throughout this recap and the additional context and my silly rewrites, I've explained pretty thoroughly why this game doesn't work for me. A lot of this is pretty fun in isolation, but so much of the game feels at odds with itself, many of the systems hardly come up again, and the conclusion feels like it was just kind of slowly meandered towards rather than being a definitive ending. In this game, the main villain just flies into a rock and explodes. In the follow-up game, the main villain just gets hit by a car. I don't know why they can't just end their games properly. One of the endings, the Mark and Kate one, is actively tied to what I see as a pointless and overly convoluted plot twist that only serves to rob Dumet of some of his character to give us a shocking moment, and the other ending is downright Looney Tunes. Irrespective of ending, Dumet continues doing his crimes and survives, much to the chagrin of the curator. Oh right, the curator. This is my 4th video on the Dark Pictures Anthology, and the only one where I'm bothering to talk about the curator. Because to me, he's just a functional host. Not as personal and interesting as Dr. Hill from Until Dawn, but better than Eliza from The Quarry. There's a lot of speculation in the fandom about exactly what this guy is and what his deal is, which is odd because he's very clearly deaf. Or at least an aspect of deaf. He walks into a cover of A Conversation with Death, also known as Oh Death. He says he meets everyone once. He has an obsession with characters dying and gets visibly frustrated to the point of angering an even more ancient and mysterious entity when he can't cross out the name of Dumet because Dumet is invincible. The concept of having Death himself as your narrator is interesting, if a bit on the nose, but outside of this I have so little to say about the curator it's unreal, mainly because he himself is such a non-entity. Even though I never discuss him, I almost never get comments asking about him. The DPA games like to reference each other, but outside of that it's an anthology with minimal overlap, and rarely does the curator feel like a presence or an active entity. He's honestly more like a React streamer, pausing the game occasionally to give his 2 obbles on things. So, to give my overall thoughts on the curator so I can finally be done with the DPA, at least for the next few months, I think he's fine, and nothing more. There's really not a lot to say about this guy, but I don't think there needs to be. Sometimes it's nice to just have a familiar face show up throughout a series. I also feel an affinity for him, both being monotone and somewhat dreary British chaps who like to talk about supermassive games. I think with this we've fully covered the first season of the Dark Pictures Anthology. It only took 5 months, so well done us. That's The Devil in Me. From its messy inception to the highly flawed and inconsistent story to the frankly bad character writing. The first season of the DPA went out not with a bang, but a whimper. That said, it's not quite enough for me to completely lose hope for the series. There's too much to enjoy here for me to completely give up and call it a wrap on things. I feel as though if the studio are able to mantle their good ideas, cut out the filler and understand their next project as a cohesive work rather than a series of systems, then they have immense potential within the world of narrative horror games. For as negative as I've been, I hope to have made it clear that there is merit to this title. A lot of good ideas, the execution is what's off. This is a bad game that skirts the border of a good one, the definition of mid. I love supermassive games. I have such a special place in my heart for this studio and their games. It was their body of work that really launched this channel and built the community that I enjoy being a part of, but I can't help but feel like they're a studio in perpetual crisis, ironically a lot like Clough Entertainment. They're always chasing the highs of past successes, innovating for the sake of marketing new features and not really understanding what all myself and many other fans want is a tight story told well. This studio isn't incapable of making great works. They made Little Nightmares, they made Until Dawn, but it just seems like they're floundering. I really hope that Directive 8020 is the greatest game ever. And if it isn't, that whatever they do after that is the greatest. But there comes a point where I have to say that I'm deluding myself. I've been Ratat. If you made it this far, you have to subscribe. Trust me, you want to be in the first 20k for the bragging rights. If you really enjoyed this video, consider becoming a member. These guys choose what upcoming videos will be on. I stream semi-regularly now, so you can come check that out if you want to ask me any questions on this video or just harass me for my takes that you disagree with. Until next time, take care.